Right. So again, good evening once again. Happy to see such a large number of people surviving such a difficult day. So we have quite an interesting panel or roundtable. Let me say a couple words about it. But first of all, let me present the two speakers. François Bourguignon, as I do it in alphabetical order. And so that was a difficult decision who goes first, so alphabetical order decided that François Bourguignon is a former senior economist and senior vice president of the World Bank. He's ex-director, former director of the Paris School of Economics. And François is a leading expert on income inequality, development, and I would like to mention only one thing just to tell about François. We serve on the same board of Global Development Network. Actually, now is a chair of director, and I'm simply a member. And we've been to India, to New Delhi last week together, and I just saw firsthand his passion, his devotion to the issues of income inequality and development, and I was just blessed to be a part of it, and I'm very happy and honored to serve in the same group with François. So the second speaker of today is Andreu Mas-Collel. Well, Andreu is a leading expert in economic theory, but it just doesn't explain everything. It doesn't describe everything. So after such a distinguished and brilliant career, so not after, but at a certain point of his career in Harvard, in Berkeley and Harvard, he came back to his native Catalonia, and where he served he was and is a professor of economics, main Pompeu Fabra, but also served in the Minister of Economy and Knowledge Economy. And so I'm just a small personal note. I'm so grateful to him. When I was very long ago, I was a young man, and I came to give my first talk in Harvard. Actually, Susan Scotchmer invited me, and then Susan, rest in peace. And he was so attentive and just spent so much time with me. I was so moved and appreciated all of that he's done for me then and since then, and so I'm really also blessed to have my paths crossed with Andreu. Now, what we will do today is we talk about Europe, but we don't talk about issues of Brexit and Catalonia, but we'll try to tackle, even though some of you may have preferred that, but so we'll tackle more basic issues, some issues of the interest of the last few years. François will talk about income inequality in European context, and Andreu will talk about the issue of education in universities in Europe, and I will try to put it together. So, well, it's a challenging evening, end of the evening, so let me give the word to François Bourguignon first.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today, and I thank the organizers and Shlomo in particular. I must say that most of the academic ties that I had with Russia were through the NES, and I'm very happy to be participating to this event. So I guess that what I have to say is happy birthday to NES, and congratulations to all those who have been able to drive that institution from infancy, 25 years ago, to what we should call adulthood. And maybe adulthood is before maturity. So maybe there will be another anniversary a couple of years from now where this will be the maturity age. Okay, so as Shlomo said, I will be talking about Europe. I mean, when Shlomo asked me invited me to this event, he didn't say anything about what I should be talking about. I mean, he said, well, this will be a joint panel with Andreu, and I was very happy to be a joint panel with Andreu. But then there was no title. And so maybe a week ago, when we were together in India, I thought, okay, but what do you want me to talk about? And then so it would be nice if you were talking about Europe. Okay, but I mean, I'm not the kind of macroeconomist specialized in European issues. No. Maybe I will talk about inequality issues in Europe. So he was not completely happy about this, and in a very non-committal way, as he often does, he simply said, look, Europe. That's very, very, in a very non-committal way. So I decided that I would talk about Europe, but I would also talk about inequality. And there will be 3 points in my presentation. The first point is really where do we stand in Europe? We just went through a very bad time. We are getting out of it. Now, what is in front of us, and what did we learn during those bad times? And the next 2 points I want to look at are quite traditional in economic analysis. I would like to talk about convergence. Some of you may remember the old days of endogenous growth theory and convergence, club of convergence. And I believe that Europe, or the European Union, was presented really as a typical club of convergence. Then where do we stand on this? And then I would like to talk, final point, on another type of convergence, which is a convergence toward the same kind of welfare state, which to a large extent has been one of the characteristics of the European countries, not only the core countries, but also those countries which joined the European Union more recently. So let me go on and say a few words about where we stand today. So, as you know, we have gone through a terrible crisis between 2008 and 2013. The rate of growth of the Union has been exactly 0. And we are now getting out of it. Since 2013 until today, the rate of growth on average has been 1.8%, except for 1 year when it was 2.3% because the Irish decided to change their initial account and to increase it by 25%, to increase GDP by 25% in 1 year. So, of course, the European average was much higher. But we are at 1.8%, and we are expecting more or less the same thing for this year, 2017, and for next year, 2018. Now, this is nice to be back to some kind of a steady state. Now, we have simply to notice that this is a rate which is certainly much lower than the rate that we had before the crisis during the 2000s, I mean, the beginning of the 2000s, which was more or less 2.4. So there is an issue somewhere about what is the potential rate of growth of Europe and whether we are not slowing down. So this is a good thing. For the first year, probably next year, all members will be expanding, including Greece. This has taken a very long time, but it is expected that next year the rate of growth of Greece will be 2.7%, which is not bad, even though, of course, they are starting from a much lower point than where they were before the crisis. So this is good. Unemployment is going down in Europe, and there is definitely an ambience of optimism which has come back, and from this point of view we must be quite satisfied. Yet there are many, many issues in front of us, and let me simply list a few of them. I won't have time to really get into the detail of that, but I think it is important to have them in mind. First, of course, what I said before, is it the case that, as in other advanced countries in the world, we are with decelerating productivity gains and decelerating rate of growth. What is happening in Europe is also happening to some extent in the United States. What is behind this deceleration of rate of growth? Do we want to reaccelerate? One thing that we observe that the rate of investment on average in the Union is much lower than it was in the beginning of this century. The rate of investment is slightly below 20%. It was much above 20% in the beginning of the century. So there is something there, which means that the full dynamism of the economy is not completely back. Unemployment goes down, but it is very high. It is more than 9%. It is 9.7%, 9.6% today. And this is very, very big. And you know that in some countries, the rate of unemployment is still above 20%. Of course, this is something which has to be corrected rather quickly. Now, there are several countries which still have a significant deficit of their budget, which means that the adjustment policies, which have been very, very rush in the past years, are not completely finished. I mean, there are several countries which are now below the 3% threshold of deficit, which has been set by the Maastricht Treaty. But many countries, including my country, are right at the limit, minus 2.9. And Mr. Macron is doing all what he can to make sure that he will stay below 3%. If not, his European strategy may be in trouble. But you have the same thing in Spain, which is still above 3% this year, but should be below 3% next year. So the adjustment is not completely finished, and we have to make sure that there is enough dynamism in the economy to make the rest of the adjustment easier than the beginning has been. Now, another problem is the fact that in many countries, the level of the debt is very high. There are several countries with a debt to GDP ratio which is much above 100%. Of course, the maximum is for Greece, where the ratio is 170%. Now, the problem is not so much maybe the debt, because we are living very well these days with such a debt, but this is linked to one of the most important issues in front of us, which is the exit from the quantitative easing or the accommodating monetary policy by the European Central Bank over the last couple of years. If we are getting out of that policy, and if rates of interest start going up again, then it is clear that all those countries with a high level of debt will be in trouble because their deficit will increase at the same time as the rate of interest, and something has to be done from that point of view, which means that if the increase in the rate of interest were too brutal, then many countries would be in trouble and would be more or less in the same situation as at the beginning of the crisis. I would say that most importantly, the causes for the crisis have not really been cured. We understood, or we could see, what many people said, that there was something missing in the European construction, and that we only were walking or dancing on one leg instead of two legs. And the problem is that we still have only one leg. And if there is another crisis, things will be very difficult, and especially today, if there was another shock, major shock in the European economies or in the global economy, then some countries are more fragile than the others, and because there are many of them, then we would be in difficulty in the sense that the only instrument that we have at our disposal, which is a monetary policy, is already at some limit. So this is, I would say, the most important issue these days in Europe is what next? We have to make progress to make sure that the kind of the way in which we dealt with the precedent crisis, which was really very, very severe, very difficult to have several countries with a very high level of unemployment, with negative growth rates for several years. The social cost of the crisis has been absolutely enormous. And the political cost may also be substantial in the sense that many people are simply not confident anymore in what Europe can do after what they have gone through because of the crisis. So something has to be done. Until now, we could see that the politicians, the elite, the rulers in the various countries have been very timid, not to say timorous, to do anything. Today we have Mr. Macron, who launched some initiative with respect to Europe. Until a few days ago, most people thought that he was the only one trying to do or claiming to do something. But maybe things are changing these days because of what is going on in Germany and the possibility that the socialist, the SPD, Social Democrat Party, may be joining with a stronger position the Grand Coalition, and this might work in the direction of Mr. Macron. But it is not to defend my own president, but I really believe that it is absolutely essential for this kind of initiative to be present and for this kind of initiative to make it to the end. So we need to consolidate the situation we are in. It is, I think, a satisfaction to remember that 7 years ago, many people were predicting that the Eurozone would be dismantled and that because of that, the European Union will be in real trouble. It is very nice to know that they were completely right, but for the completely wrong reasons, because the Eurozone stayed fast, but it's true that the Union is dismantling. Shlomo said that we didn't have to talk about the Brexit, but of course the Brexit is producing a change in the Union, although we don't know whether it will be hard or soft Brexit. So this is for the state of the play in Europe and the way in which we can see things in Europe. Now, a few words about the long run and this view of Europe as a convergence club in terms of economic growth. It is quite striking to see that over time, indeed, when we look at the whole of European Union, when we look at all the countries in the European Union today, including still the UK, the 28 countries, the distance between the poorest countries and the richest countries. Let's not take the richest country, which is Luxembourg, and which is a very, very particular country, but let's look at the mean of the 3 richest countries and the mean of the 3 poorest countries. The distance between them went from 1 to 3 back in the mid-80s to today 1 to 2. So the difference is quite substantial. There has been really convergence, and I would like to illustrate this with a chart which is here. Inequality in Europe, but inequality in a very, very simple way, not taking into account inequality within countries. It's only inequality between countries. And if you want, this is another way of presenting what was called in the old days sigma convergence, that is distance, I mean the variance between the GDP per capita in the various countries. So the green curve is the EU 28, the 28 members, as if those countries had always been member of the EU, and you see that there is a very clear downward trend showing this very strong convergence that we had. And the blue curve is the same curve, but taking into account the various enlargements events. So you have 12 people until the first vertical bar, 12 countries, then 15 members, and then 24 members, and we end up with 28. And every time you see that there is a big change in 2004, when all the Eastern European countries move in, then this is increasing inequality, but then the downward trend continues. So this is interesting to see that, at least from that point of view, there is something important going on, and the poorest members are getting richer and are reducing the gap with the richest countries. While putting together this chart, I thought that it would be interesting to have a more general view than the European Union, to look at all of Europe and to include Central Asia, the neighboring countries, and to include the Russian Federation too. And this is what I have is in this chart. So the scale is not exactly the same, but the top curve is the evolution of the distribution of GDP per capita in all that area, Europe, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. And you can see that you have exactly the same shape. Of course, the beginning of the curve corresponds to the transition years. And because of that, there was an increase in inequality because the eastern part of this area was not growing as fast as the others. But then after the end of the transition, we have a clear convergence of all the area. An interesting issue on which I don't have, I look for an answer to that question, is whether those countries coming from the eastern part of Europe, joining the Union in 2004, had grown faster because they were in Europe than the others. When you make a comparison, direct comparison, the answer is no. Because when you compare Hungary and Poland and Latvia to countries like Moldova, Belarus, or Ukraine or Kazakhstan, then on average, the rate of growth of the NATO countries is higher than the rate of growth of those new or recent members of the Union. But it is difficult to go much beyond that because those countries in general are also much poorer. And assuming that there is convergence at all levels, those poor countries will grow faster than less poor countries which joined the Union. So this is an interesting question, but I could not find in the literature a very rigorous answer to the question, what was the contribution of joining the Union for these countries? I think it is a question that is of interest today, given the fact that in some countries there is some doubt about the benefit from joining the Union. Now, this is one type of convergence, and I believe we have to be happy about this. Another type of convergence, which I believe is interesting, is the fact that all those countries which join the European Union, as well as countries within the European Union, have had something resembling the convergence in terms of the way in which the redistribution system works, the way in which distribution is taking place. And my next chart is really about the way in which income inequality has changed within the European countries. So we saw before inequality between countries. This is inequality within several countries. Now, it is inequality in Europe plus the US, because these days, when we talk about inequality, it is very, very difficult not to use the US as a benchmark. And this is a top curve, and you can see that, as everybody knows, inequality is increasing steadily in the United States, and has been doing that for a long time. Here, the chart starts in 1985, but the increase in the US started before. Now, what is interesting is that when you look at all the other countries, which are European countries, when you compare 1985 and 2015, it is true that it is often the case that inequality is higher in 2015 than in 1985. But there are different patterns. You have the patterns of the countries at the bottom, which are Denmark and Sweden, where inequality has increased continuously, like in the United States, with the big difference that those countries were starting from an extremely low level of inequality. a Gini coefficient, which is the index that I'm using here, equal to a little more than 0.2. And today, they are still, despite the fact that inequality has increased, they are still at the bottom of the range of inequality in Europe. The other countries are something quite interesting, which is the fact that inequality increased between 1985 and 2015, but at one point of time, and then stayed more or less flat. This is a case of the UK, the purple curve. This is a case of Italy, the blue curve, and those two countries definitely have a higher level of inequality than the average in Europe. But this is also the case of Germany, with a big change taking place in the beginning of the 2000s, at the time Germany decided to adopt the arts laws to reform the labor market. And then after that, you have again, a plateau in inequality. So the point is that there is a fundamental difference between those countries and the US in the sense that there is a stability. Maybe it is higher today than it was in some cases in 1985, but we have something definitely going on. And you can see that there is a convergence on this. Now, if we look at the countries which are the recent members, which are the Eastern European countries. And again, as a benchmark, the top curve here is for the Russian Federation, because I thought that it was interesting and important to show that inequality today in the Russian Federation is completely comparable to inequality in the US, and much higher than inequality in Europe. And you can see that in the few countries which are there, only Romania is above the range of inequality that we find in Europe. All the others are between 0.25 and 0.33 in terms of the Gini coefficient, which is what we have for the ancient members of the European Union. So from that point of view, we have something which is interesting in the sense that countries are getting into the Union and have similar patterns in terms of the way in which the society is distributing its resources. The problem that when we make this kind of comment based on standard data, these are the OECD data, and they are based on household surveys. When you divide the household income by the number of people in the household, taking into account equivalent scales because of children not needing the same thing as adults. If we look at another source of data, which is becoming extremely important these days, very much debated these days, which is the data coming from tax data, and which are concerned with the top of the income distribution. The problem with those data is that in many countries, we know very well that we are missing the very top. And either people are not there in the survey, or they don't want to answer the surveys, or basically they may be cheating on the income they have. And when we look at those data on tax data coming from tax information, then we get a picture which corresponds to this. Again, at the bottom, you have purely European countries, and as benchmarks, again, you find the United States, which is light blue, and the Russian Federation, which is deep blue. And again, it's quite interesting to see that there is a convergence between those two big countries in terms of inequality. You see that today, the share of market income before taxes and transfers, etc., going to the top 1% is equal to 20% in the two countries. In comparison, in Europe, most countries are much below 15%. But what is striking is the fact that all those curves are upward sloping, and they are still upward sloping. And this is true for the curve at the bottom, Sweden, and this is true for the curve at the top, UK, and this is true for the intermediate curve. So there is an issue there in the sense that our analysis of what is going on with income inequality and the way in which the whole system in European countries works is ambivalent in the sense that the two data sources are not saying exactly the same thing. What is quite possible is that when we look at earnings or income from labor, income from work, the first data set is much better, and then we have this kind of convergence I was mentioning before, and this kind of constant or stable inequality. But when we look at the very top, then it is most likely that there is something going on and more inequality being built up there. What is interesting that this is true in Europe, this is true in the US, in Russia, this is true in several developing countries, and this has to be related to another phenomenon which is absolutely common to all countries almost in the world, which is the fact that when we look at the macro distribution of income between labor and property, then we find that in most countries, the share going to labor is going down. And this is a long-run trend, and this is something that we have to live with. So I've been probably too long, although I was expecting that I would have some signal about this. But let me conclude.
You just eliminated me.
You should have. Okay. Okay, I conclude. So now, let me. What I take from all this is that we are on the right path. There are many good signs about what is going on in Europe. I believe that what I've said about inequality is something which is important in the sense that there is no deviance of one country with respect to the others, and there is a kind of more or less uniform evolution, and I think that this is something quite important if we really want to go beyond a purely economic European Union. So this is where we are. We certainly have a long way to go if we have in mind this ideal federal state for Europe that many people have in mind. But I believe that we are also a very long way from where we were in 1957 when the Rome Treaty was signed, and for those of us, they are not very numerous, who could read in those days, of course I'm one of them, yes, I mean the difference that we can see is truly enormous. And I believe that despite the difficulties that we may be meeting in our path, there are all reasons to be optimistic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, let me see.
First things first, my apologies for the orthographical mistake. First of all, congratulations to the school, and I also would like to recognize Gur Offer, who many years ago was responsible for putting me in the International Advisory Board, and that was quite an experience, which obviously had been very fruitful. I did also encounter the same problem that him, namely the session had to be about Europe and what of Europe, and then there was the suggestion, well, some easy and uncontroversial topics such as secession movements in Europe. I said, no way, no way, and that leaves that. Then I had no choice because I have, academically speaking, I have only worked in one thing on Europe, which is 10 years ago, I participated in this in writing this Bruegel blueprint on higher education in Europe. So I thought that it would be appropriate to look back at it and get some idea of what has happened these 10 years, or take some consequences from it. This being a higher education institution, I thought it was fitting, although I must say that this work did not cover the Russian Federation. So I apologize. Well, it was European Union. By the way, Shlomo, when you want me to stop, you just fall.
Can you stop?
Or you just kick him out. Okay, this work was written on the. It was with Guillaume de Vatripon, Caroline Hodsby, myself, Andreu Sapir, and it was written when the Bologna process was culminating, and the model was being instaurated in Europe. It was also 2008, written in the long wake of the Lisbon agenda, where, if some of you remember, the European Union declared its will to become, by 2010, the most competitive knowledge-based economy in the world. A very nice sentence that means we want to overcome the US. Now, this agenda in 2000 was nonsense in 2000, but in 2008 it was already obvious that it was so. But all the authors here were very committed not to the agenda, but to what it meant. At any rate, and that explains that all the analysis is very influenced by the American model. At any rate, it was beginning to be clear by then that the battle would not be on becoming the first knowledge-based economy in the world, but retaining the second position, and a struggle that still continues, in which Brexit, by the way, will not particularly help. So, I am happy to communicate that this work has withstood the test of time very well. All the recommendations remain valid. They were recommendations for 10 years. So now there have been some modifications, but basically I can simply repeat them, and that's what I will do. It's good to remember that that we are not progressing as fast as we should. So our conclusion 10 years ago, I mean, there was some surveys. It was the Shanghai ranking then, and its beginnings played its role. There were some econometric analysis. There are two associated papers, but our conclusions were that the key factors for university performance were funding and autonomy of the institutions, and in both dimensions, Europe was lacking when compared to the United States, for example. We also said something that I suppose is a bit more interesting, which is that the effect of the two was multiplicative, meaning, in particular, that the effect of a given amount of extra funding was superior if there was more autonomy in the institution than if it was less autonomy in the institution. The recommendation in fundings that we gave then were, by the way, I recommend it, still is available, etc. the recommendation of fundings were in 10 years increase the annual expenditure in higher education in the European Union in 1% of European Union GDP. This has not happened. The expenditure on higher education in Europe is very fixed at 1.3. It was 1.3 already at the beginning of in 2001, 2002, and it remains there. So this has not happened. The crisis, I suppose, it has not helped. There is a lot of inequality in this amount, but also some curious things, like, for example, some of the most successful countries don't spend much. For example, the United Kingdom, it's below this 1.3, so the Brexit will not increase this percentage, but it will be more or less the same. There are other successful countries which spend a lot. This is all expenditure, private and public. Like, for example, Switzerland, not in the European Union, or Sweden. Look, I repeat the recommendation: increase 1% in the next 10 years. Now we are recovering. You have heard that we are getting out of the hole. So investing in higher education is a very good thing. Usually we talk about the gap on research. The expenditure on research is roughly 3 and something more percent in the US. In Europe is now at 2. So we always, and the official policy of repeated, it also goes back to Lisbon, and then repeated several times, as official policy that we aim in Europe to a 1 point increase, a 1% point increase in research expenditure. That's not the same 1% gap. So there are two 1% gaps. There is a 1% gap in research. There is a 1% gap in higher education. By the way, the equivalent figure in the US is 3.3. So 1.3 in Europe, 3.3 in the US expenditure in higher education. We didn't think that it would be necessary to get to 3.3, but it would be good to advance a bit. And in that respect, one has to be realistic. It is fine to look for endowments. The institutions should look for endowments, but there are no miracles, and it is good on its own right to try to capitalize and to get returns from intellectual property. But neither the returns from intellectual property or from endowments will make a difference in a 10-year span. They may help, but in a 10-year span, extra income can only come in significant amounts either from public budget or from students' fees. On fees, which is a controversial topic, our position was, and mine is, that because of equity considerations, fees covering costs, not fees zero, fees covering costs, are not desirable at undergraduate level. And for very different reasons, efficiency, innovation, stimulus reasons, neither at PhD level. But they could be contemplated at master level if coupled with fellowships or income contingent loans in the Australian style, which have been now been adopted, and that has happened in the last 10 years in the United Kingdom, also at the undergraduate, level. So this is. Would make this a strong recommendation. If you ever consider undergraduate fees or master fees, make sure to complement them with fellowships, perhaps income contingent fellowships, which actually it's the practice in the US too, or income contingent laws. And since these days it is fashionable to say that three things are incompatible, and everyone has its model of three things, let me put one here, which is already in the book. So we came up with one by ourselves. Namely, the three things are fees below cost, mobility of students, and restricted fiscal constituencies. Suppose restricted fiscal constituencies we have, universities are not financed from the EU budget, so and this is a real case. If Belgium builds up its medical studies, and they become so good or more open access that the French medical studies, then you have French medical students pouring into France, pouring into Belgium, and of course they are not covering the cost of their studies. So actually, the Belgians are subsidizing the French, which is okay, but it didn't seem okay to them. They went to the European Court and actually won against the principle of free mobility on Europe, and that's anecdotal. They won on the following argument. Judges and lawyers are very smart. The European Union regulation allow for exception measures for public health reasons. And so the reasoning was that having local doctors was a public health issue. So if all the doctors trained in Belgium were French, which meant a high propensity to go back to France, that there could be a scarcity of doctors in Belgium, and therefore that could be a public health threat. But that was just a narrow escape. So I think this is a real issue. I could say we, because we discuss these things. We think that not so much on the undergraduate level, because we don't think that at the undergraduate level, beyond the Erasmus temporal programs, there will be huge movements of undergraduates going through Europe to get degrees. In fact, even in the United States, most college students study near home. So we think. We were sort of thought that competition will increase quality, but not necessarily movements of undergraduates. But at the graduate level, mobility, it's almost unavoidable. So I will say that at the graduate level, graduate, master, professional level, PhD is another matter. The future model is going to be fees covering cost, and then every fiscal constituency will have support programs for the youngster of their own taxpayers to go to study somewhere, maybe in the own constituency, maybe beyond. The second recommendation was more autonomy, and I warned that autonomy is not self-government. This is a very usual confusion in Europe. Autonomy means legal standing, means owning the assets, owning the buildings, for example, capacity to contract, control over personnel, salaries, curricular policies. And in this, there has been some progress in the last 10 years. I believe now French universities own their buildings. It used not to be the case. So the ministry owned the buildings. I think now they own their own buildings. And ideally, there should be a board. The board decides on policy. There should be professional management structures and a participation mechanism. One should not forget that universities are collegial entities, and the collegiality should be preserved. As I say, there has been progress in the last 10 years. The laws in different countries, for example, in Finland or in Austria, changed in the right direction. Also in Portugal. I am tempted to say that everywhere, but in my own place. Next. Yeah, that's the. This is a summary of what I have been covering. In the booklet, we also mention a number of issues on mobility, which I would like to quickly summarize. On students is what I have told you a moment ago. One would and should contemplate a substantial increase in second cycle on masters and on master mobility, for example, but probably not so much on undergraduate for full degrees. Yes, Erasmus style. Faculty, I don't have anything new to say. I think there is mobility more intra-country than inter-country, but that's clearly on the rise, especially in the elite institutions. In the booklet, we propose no endogamy principle or pact, and this has not taken place, and so it's still an open issue. So it will be wonderful if the universities in Europe took as a touch of academic quality and distinction, adopted the principle of no endogamy, meaning that at least at the department level, at least, better even at the university level, took the position of not hiring their own doctors. I must say that the advantage of this principle is not simply what is usually said, that inbreeding is not good, that gives variety, etc. That's there. Huh? But besides that, this is the not hiring your own students is a magnificent stimulus, a magnificent quality of stimulus on PhD programs. It's very different when you have the possibility of generating your own demand than when you don't have the possibility of generating your own demand. Research funding has improved I will say dramatically with the emergence of the ERC, and we should lobby for that to stay and to develop further. The ERC includes goes beyond the European Union, and some of the most successful countries are actually outside the European Union, namely Switzerland and Israel. Graduate fellowships, we propose, this has not happened, we also propose a program following the American model, parallel to the NSF graduate fellowships. The US every year, the NSF distributes 1,000 fellowships, graduate fellowships on STEM disciplines, science, technology, mathematics, and that is a sign of quality, and it's very sought after by graduate schools in the US. There is some of that in Europe through the Marie Curie programs, but the Marie Curie tend to be to advance graduate students. But there is a principle of that. And finally, we also took a page from the German Excellence Initiative, which has not prospered, which would be to fund at the European level graduate schools. The postdoctoral training and doctoral training is very expensive. So that's sometimes in Europe is not quite realized. In the US, there must be depends on how one counts it. If one counts everything is 600. If one doesn't count everything, it's something like 230 universities that do PhDs. In Europe is by the thousand. There is no higher education institution that does not want, and in fact does not produce doctors. The result is that the investment per PhD in the US is much higher than the investment per doctor or PhD in Europe. In this proposal, we propose something like, just a quick count, like 1 billion a year could sustain 20 graduate schools. If you put them by field, which you shouldn't, but if you put them by field, could support 20 graduate schools in you partition knowledge in 50 areas. You could support 20 graduate schools in 50 areas with 1 million euros a year. 1 billion is 1% of the budget of the European Union, and something like 15% at this point of the budget of the European Research Council. As I say, the Germans have done this, and I think it's a good initiative. So, let's wait 10 more years, invite me in 10 more years with a bit more time, and I will prepare better. Thank you very much.
We don't have much time, but still, short questions to our speakers, please. Yeah, Andrea, yeah.
Yes, so I had a European question. I was wondering, do you think that part of the problems that the EU has been going through is because there is still this idea of sovereignty, which is quite strong, and part of the direction that the EU is going towards, they're going towards sort of a supranational organization, and without sort of overtly saying, we're trying to go over the nation states. And in Italian, we have this saying, making the step longer than the leg. So, we want to go towards a certain direction, and perhaps we haven't done enough to move public opinion in that direction, and this is what's generating the pushback.
No, you're absolutely right that this is an existential question of the European Union and of for the attitude of people with respect to the Union. My own feeling is that without saying it, we are going in that direction. but no politician would ever say that he or she is in favor of some supranational authority. But, for example, if we look at the last proposal by Macron, which has been supported by Mr. Schulz in Germany, this idea of creating a Minister of the Economy for the Union to create a budget that would, the minister would manage a much more important budget for the Union, is exactly a step in that direction. In the same way as when it was decided to create a Minister of Foreign Affairs at the European level, this was a step in that direction. Now, the problem is that the relationship between those supranational ministers and the national ministers is unclear. And you're right that for the moment, what is really running the Union is the Council of Heads of State. And as long as this will be the case, there will be no real move toward a supranational thing. But I'm not sure that we can imagine that we can make progress without going in that direction.
Yeah.
So just to balance things, I have a question regarding the educational system, higher education in Europe. So to what extent do you think that part of the woes of the higher education in Europe are due to the fact that there is, so far at least, we don't have the emergence of a single paradigm? So what's the right way to run a higher education institution? Because it seems that in Europe, I mean, in the US, there is more or less a model that will, with a bit of variation, is accepted. In Europe, we have to compete with the German model, the French model, there is the UK model. I'm not exactly sure how things happen in France, but there seems to be discrepancy. You think, you know, is that a problem? Should we converge, or we can learn to live with that?
All the models are in flux, and I will say that slowly, very slowly, more slowly than ideal, they are converging, and this convergence to whatever end up going will have a strong influence, but will not be identical that the American model. I will expect that it will be more egalitarian, that the notion of excellence will be more dispersed, and that's an European challenge. And I think in the US there is a lot of verticalization. Sometimes people say the best universities in the world are in the US, and the worst universities in the world are in the US. And if you look at the rankings of Shanghai, it's true that Europe looks better if you look at proportions of the 500 top universities that of the 50 top universities. In the 50 top universities, there is an overwhelming dominance of the US. That we also mentioned there, as you go further down, the proportion of Europe increases. So we could say that the challenge in Europe is to keep an average level which is reasonable and to allow or to graft into it peaks. So Europe needs peaks, but not at the cost of lowering the average. And I repeat, that is the challenge. As for the peaks, the formula again is the US. The success of, say, Switzerland, take Lausanne.
The best practices for Pompeu, Fabra to lose.
Or Lausanne, for example, all those places are characterized by hiring practices which had been learned from the top of the American universities more than from the British universities, in spite of the fact that the British universities are very strong. But well, let's not now mention and compare LSE or UCL with Cambridge or so. But I think on hiring practices of faculty, I think that is pretty. That's pretty clear. But I also would not want to say just make tabula rasa and we should do as in the US. There are good features of the European landscape, but to build the peaks, probably the best formula is to see what the emerging peaks are doing.
Okay, thank you. It was an exciting session in more ways than one, but I'm grateful to François and Andreu for their contribution. Thank you.